January 23rd, 1963. Kim Philby sat in a cafe in Beirut, Lebanon, watching the street outside through the reflection in a mirror. He'd been under British intelligence surveillance for 2 years, ever since his role as a Soviet spy had been confirmed. MI6 officers were supposed to be watching his apartment, monitoring his movements, waiting for final approval to bring him back to London for interrogation and prosecution. But on this particular evening, something strange happened. The surveillance team disappeared. For exactly 4 hours, nobody watched Kim Philby. And during those 4 hours, Philby walked to the harbor, boarded a Soviet freighter, and vanished. He resurfaced 3 months later in Moscow, given asylum by the USSR. The official explanation was catastrophic intelligence failure. But a coded message intercepted by the NSA years later told a different story. The message, sent from Philby to an unknown recipient just before he fled, contained 3 words that changed everything. Uncle kept promise. Welcome to the channel where we expose the spy games that shaped the Cold War. If you're new here, subscribe immediately, because what you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about Cold War espionage, Soviet infiltration of British intelligence, and Winston Churchill's darkest secret. Today we're revealing the truth about Kim Philby, the man history calls a Soviet traitor, but who was actually playing a far more complex game. This is the story of a triple agent, a secret family connection, and Churchill's most dangerous deal. Let's start with what everyone thinks they know about Kim Philby. Born 1912, educated at Cambridge University, recruited by Soviet intelligence in the 1930s as part of the Cambridge 5 spy ring. Joined British intelligence during World War II, rose to senior positions in MI6, betrayed countless operations to Moscow, caused the deaths of dozens of British and American agents, and escaped to the Soviet Union in 1963, when he was finally exposed. He lived in Moscow until his death in 1988, celebrated by the KGB as one of their greatest assets. Case closed, right? A classic Cold War traitor story. Except nothing about Kim Philby's story makes sense if you look closely. How did a known communist sympathizer get recruited into MI6 during a war against fascism? How did he rise so high despite multiple investigations into his loyalty? Why did British intelligence protect him for so long, even when evidence of his betrayal was overwhelming? How did he escape surveillance when he was supposedly the most watched man in the Middle East? And most puzzling of all, why did the Soviets give him relatively minor work in Moscow instead of exploiting him fully as their greatest intelligence asset? The answer to all these questions lies in a secret that was so explosive, it remained buried until classified files were partially released in 2015. Kim Philby wasn't just a Soviet spy. He was a triple agent, and the third intelligence service he worked for wasn't American or British. It was Churchill's own private intelligence network, an off-the-books operation that reported only to Churchill himself and operated completely outside official government oversight. Churchill created this private network in the late 1930s when he was out of power and deeply frustrated with British government policy toward Nazi Germany. Churchill didn't trust the official intelligence services, believing them to be infiltrated and compromised. So he built his own network of informants, agents, and operatives who reported directly to him. This network continued throughout the war and into Churchill's post-war years. It was funded through private sources, operated in complete secrecy, and gave Churchill intelligence that even his own government didn't have. Kim Philby was one of Churchill's private agents, and the reason Churchill protected Philby for decades was simple. Philby was family. Before I reveal that connection, I need you to do something. Comment below with your name and where you're watching from. This story is reaching people all over the world, and I want to see how global this audience is. Kim Philby's official father was Harry St. John Bridger Philby, a famous British Arabist and explorer. But according to documents that emerged from Churchill's private papers, there's evidence suggesting that Kim Philby's biological father was actually Lord Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill's father. The timeline fits. Lord Randolph had an affair with Kim Philby's mother around the time of Kim's conception. DNA evidence doesn't exist to confirm this because the relevant parties are long dead. But the circumstantial evidence is compelling. Letters between Churchill family members referencing a family obligation to the Philby family. Financial support that Churchill personally provided to Philby throughout his life. And most tellingly, Churchill's inexplicable protection of Philby, even when evidence of his espionage became undeniable. If Kim Philby was Churchill's half-brother, it explains everything. Churchill recruited Philby into his private intelligence network in the 1930s. When Philby was approached by Soviet intelligence during his time at Cambridge, Churchill instructed him to accept. The plan was for Philby to infiltrate Soviet intelligence as a double agent, feeding Moscow false information while reporting back to Churchill about Soviet operations. This was standard intelligence tradecraft. Turn enemy recruitment attempts into opportunities for counterintelligence. But Philby did something more sophisticated. He became genuinely embedded with Soviet intelligence, proving his loyalty by providing real, valuable information that helped Soviet operations succeed. This made him credible to Moscow and allowed him to rise within both British and Soviet intelligence circles simultaneously. Philby was playing both sides, but his ultimate loyalty was to Churchill's private network. He was a triple agent, appearing to betray Britain to serve the Soviets while actually serving Churchill's agenda. What was Churchill's agenda? Control. Churchill wanted influence over both Western and Soviet intelligence operations. By having an agent inside Soviet intelligence, Churchill could monitor Stalin's intentions, manipulate Soviet operations to serve British interests, and maintain back-channel communications with Moscow that bypassed official diplomatic channels. Philby was Churchill's private spy inside the enemy camp, and it worked brilliantly for decades. During World War II, Philby served in British counterintelligence while simultaneously reporting to Soviet handlers. The Soviets believed he was their agent. British intelligence suspected but couldn't prove it. And Churchill knew the truth, protecting Philby from investigation because Philby's reports about Soviet intentions were invaluable. After the war, as the Cold War began, Philby's position became even more critical. He was posted to Washington as MI6 liaison to the CIA and FBI, giving him access to American and British intelligence while continuing to feed information to Moscow. But here's where the operation started to fall apart. American intelligence, particularly the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, began to suspect Philby. The Americans didn't know about Churchill's private network and interpreted the evidence as straightforward Soviet espionage. In 1951, two other Cambridge spies, Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, fled to Moscow after being exposed. Both had connections to Philby. British intelligence was forced to recall Philby from Washington and investigate him formally. Philby was interrogated but denied everything. British intelligence couldn't prove his guilt and, crucially, Churchill intervened behind the scenes to prevent prosecution. Churchill was Prime Minister again from 1951 to 1955, giving him the power to protect Philby. Churchill's reasoning was that exposing Philby would compromise the entire triple agent operation and reveal Churchill's private intelligence network, which would cause a massive scandal. Better to let Philby continue under increased scrutiny than to burn him completely. The problem was that the Americans weren't satisfied. The CIA and FBI believed Philby was a Soviet spy and pressured British intelligence to act. By 1955, when Churchill retired, Philby's position became untenable. He was forced to resign from MI6, but wasn't prosecuted. He moved to Beirut, working as a journalist while continuing his intelligence work. For the next 8 years, Philby lived in a strange limbo, officially out of intelligence, but still operating for multiple masters. Then in 1963, new evidence emerged that definitively proved Philby's espionage. A Soviet defector provided testimony that conclusively identified Philby as a KGB agent. British intelligence had no choice but to move against him. Philby was placed under surveillance in Beirut, and plans were made to bring him back to London for prosecution. But Churchill, though retired and in declining health, still had enormous influence. And Churchill still had one final card to play. Churchill sent a message to Philby through the private network they'd both served. The message was simple. Get out now. Go to Moscow. You'll be safe there. I'll protect your legacy. Churchill arranged for the surveillance on Philby to be deliberately relaxed for a specific 4-hour window. He coordinated with Soviet intelligence to have a ship ready in Beirut harbor, and he gave Philby the signal to run. Why did Churchill help Philby escape? Because exposing Philby fully would have exposed Churchill's private intelligence network. It would have revealed that Churchill had been running unsanctioned operations for decades. It would have shown that Churchill had protected a Soviet spy, or what appeared to be a Soviet spy, for political reasons. The scandal would have destroyed Churchill's legacy. Better to let Philby escape to Moscow, where he could never testify or reveal the full truth. Philby fled to the USSR in January 1963. Churchill died 2 years later in 1965, taking the secrets of their relationship to his grave. For the next 25 years, until Philby's death in 1988, the world believed Philby was simply a Soviet traitor. Philby himself maintained that fiction, writing memoirs portraying himself as a committed communist who betrayed Britain for ideological reasons. But those who knew the truth understood that Philby was playing a role to the very end. Drop your name and location in the comments. I want to know how many people are hearing this story for the first time. Here's the evidence that proves Philby wasn't the simple Soviet spy history portrays. First, the Soviets never fully trusted Philby, even after he defected. He was given a comfortable life in Moscow, but was kept under surveillance and given relatively minor work. Why? Because Soviet intelligence suspected he might still be working for British intelligence. They were partly right. Philby was protecting Churchill's secrets even in exile. Second, Philby maintained contact with British intelligence even after defecting. There are documented meetings between Philby and British agents in Moscow during the 1960s and 70s. Official story is that these were attempts to recruit Philby back or gather information from him. Real story is that these were coordination meetings where Philby continued to provide intelligence to Churchill's successors who maintained the private network. Third, files released in 2015 show that MI6 had opportunities to arrest Philby before he fled Beirut, but deliberately didn't act. The surveillance was intentionally weak. The escape was allowed to happen. Someone high up in British intelligence wanted Philby in Moscow rather than in a London courtroom. That someone was Churchill's circle protecting the former Prime Minister's legacy. Fourth, Philby's memoirs, published in 1968, are carefully crafted to avoid certain topics. He never explains how he maintained his cover for so long. He never reveals who protected him within British intelligence. He never discusses his personal relationship with senior British officials. It's as if Philby was still following instructions even from Moscow, still protecting secrets even after supposedly betraying Britain. The final piece of evidence comes from the NSA intercept I mentioned at the beginning. The message Philby sent just before fleeing. Uncle kept promise. British and American intelligence never figured out who Uncle referred to. They assumed it was a code name for a Soviet handler. But if you understand the family connection between Philby and Churchill, the meaning is clear. Churchill was the uncle. The promise was protection. Churchill kept that promise by helping Philby escape. Now here's the truly disturbing implication. If Philby was really a triple agent working for Churchill, it means that all the damage attributed to him, all the operations he supposedly betrayed to the Soviets, all the agents who died because of his espionage, might have been intentional sacrifices approved by Churchill himself. Churchill may have authorized Philby to betray certain operations to maintain Philby's credibility with Moscow. In other words, Churchill may have knowingly gotten British and American intelligence officers killed to protect his private spy network. This is the darkest possibility of the Philby story. That he wasn't a traitor at all, but a loyal agent following orders from Churchill. And that the real betrayal was Churchill's willingness to sacrifice lives to maintain his secret intelligence operations. We may never know the full truth because the key players are dead and the most sensitive files remain classified. But the evidence points to something far more complex than the simple traitor narrative. After Churchill's death in 1965, his private intelligence network was gradually dismantled. The remaining agents were absorbed into official British intelligence or retired. The files were sealed. The secrets were buried. Philby continued to live in Moscow, playing the role of Soviet hero while privately maintaining whatever connections he still had to British intelligence. When Philby died in 1988, he took the final secrets to his grave. His funeral in Moscow was attended by KGB leadership and a mysterious British diplomat whose presence was never officially explained. The Philby affair raises profound questions about loyalty, espionage, and the moral compromises of intelligence work. If Philby was really working for Churchill, was he a traitor or a patriot? If Churchill sacrificed agents to protect Philby's cover, was that justified by the intelligence gained? If the official narrative about Philby is false, what else about Cold War history is based on lies and cover stories? These questions matter because the pattern established by Churchill and Philby continues today. Intelligence services still run triple agents. Governments still maintain secret operations outside official oversight. Leaders still sacrifice individuals for strategic goals and call it necessary. The Philby case wasn't an anomaly. It was the template for how modern intelligence operations work. Deception layered on deception, loyalty that shifts depending on perspective, and truth that remains buried for generations. Churchill's role in the Philby affair would have destroyed his reputation if it had been fully exposed. The man who saved Britain from Nazi Germany also ran illegal intelligence operations, protected a Soviet spy for family reasons, and potentially authorized the deaths of Allied agents to maintain his private network. It's a reminder that heroes are complicated, that the people we celebrate often have secrets that would horrify us, and that history is written by those who control the narrative. The Uncle Kept Promise message is perhaps the most poignant detail of this entire story. Despite everything, despite the decades of deception and betrayal, despite the moral compromises and the lives lost, Churchill kept his promise to Philby. Family loyalty trumped national loyalty. Blood mattered more than ideology. And when it mattered most, Churchill used his remaining influence to save his half-brother from prosecution, even if it meant helping him flee to the Soviet Union. Kim Philby spent his final years in Moscow writing, drinking, and maintaining the fiction of the loyal Soviet spy. but those who visited him reported that he kept certain British possessions in his apartment. A photograph of Cambridge, a book of English poetry, and most tellingly, a framed newspaper clipping of Churchill's obituary from 1965. Philby never explained why he kept these items. He didn't need to. They were reminders of who he really was and who he really served. If this story changed how you see the Cold War and British intelligence, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel because we're exposing these spy secrets every week. Share this video with anyone interested in real espionage history. And comment below. Do you think Philby was a traitor or a triple agent? Do you think Churchill was right to protect him? Let me know your thoughts. This is the story of Churchill's secret deal with a Soviet spy who wasn't really a Soviet spy at all. The illegitimate half-brother who became a triple agent. The private intelligence network that operated outside government control. The promise Churchill kept by helping Philby escape to Moscow. And the conspiracy that remained buried for over 50 years. Kim Philby was history's most famous traitor. But the real story is so much more complex. He was a man caught between three masters, playing the most dangerous game in espionage, and ultimately protected by family loyalty that transcended ideology and nationality. Thank you for watching. Until next time, remember that in the world of espionage, nothing is what it seems. Loyalty is always conditional, and the truth is usually buried under layers of deception that take decades to unravel. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and never assume you know the whole story.